Thank you, Fred. I remember all my wrong forecasts, and I think I've forgotten all my correct ones. One of my early bosses, I think it was Otto Eckstein, said, if you're going to forecast, forecast often. And Alan Greenspan, I think somebody was once joked, said, never put a number and a date on the same piece of paper. And we all know those. I actually started, after my PhD, two little corrections. I did my thesis with Bob Solow and Frank Fisher, and it wasn't on oil, it was on something silly. But it is actually, that experience made me much more of a macroeconomist. And my first job was with Otto Eckstein at Data Resources. I was the 10th person, 11th person in early '71. And 40 years ago, I began my career as an energy economist, literally 30 steps from here. I pasted off today. The Ford Foundation's Energy Policy Project was located over at 1776 Pennsylvania Avenue. And I was really a postdoc through Data Resources with Dale Jorgensen and with Hank Hautacher, working for David Freeman in the book that became Time to Choose, which is horribly controversial at the time, on how the United States would deal with its energy crisis. So in a sense, when I agreed to come here, I realized I have now come full circle physically, because literally it started there. And I could have shouted out the window, assuming you could open the windows in the building, and given this talk. I know it's a little cool for you. I live in near Aspen, Colorado. This is warm weather for us right now. It's great to be here. Let me talk. What I'm doing is trying to put together a book, and it's a stunning conclusion. I'll give you the Cliff Notes versions first. For 40 years, most of us looked and said this pursuit of energy independence was silly. We were never going to go there. Energy independence, meaning the United States is a net exporter of oil or oil and gas. Couldn't happen. A few months ago, I started pushing the numbers around, and it's something. The numbers just were changing so rapidly, and you think of that phrase, "Circumstances have changed." Well, this is the thing, and the more you looked at it, the more you realized maybe the United States is going to become a net exporter. Certainly, that portion of the United States bounded by the Appalachian Mountains and on the west by Utah and Nevada will be a net exporter. And this doesn't count Canada. So that everything we thought about, everything we'd planned had changed. And what this is going to mean is that the U.S. is now going to be the low-cost industrialized country for energy. We're going to have a cost advantage of sometimes between 50, 70, maybe 80% in terms of energy relative to other countries. And this is going to persist for some time. The original title of this paper and the book may be Halftime in America, after the great commercial for Chrysler Super Bowl. But the point is, everything has changed. And so that firms that want to manufacture petrochemicals or so on will move to the United States. And we're already seeing this. We've seen this now in announcements. Unfortunately, before I could get this to press and everything, Shell figured this out, and they've announced a major ethylene cracker in Pennsylvania. Nobody's done that, as far as I know, for about 15 years. There have been additions to ethylene cracking. These are billion-dollar projects. They're not small projects. There are 3 or 4 others coming. Other industries are coming, and we have this cost advantage. Now, as John Williamson, when he first read my outline, and John was a teacher at MIT, so we go way back. John pointed out to me that, in fact, how can this be? There's arbitrage. And so the United States can get, the fact is, there is no arbitrage in natural gas. It will be years before you can build the billion-dollar projects to liquefy the natural gas, to take it out, even if the Congress lets it happen quickly. And to get that, the Department of Energy may certify it, but then you have to get the regulatory permissions and so on. And Clyde Prestowitz quite recently noted in the Financial Times the difference between the free trade push and the mercantilism that kind of goes on behind the scenes, that goes on in China, that limits U.S. imports, that's gone on in Japan, that every country practices. Well, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is going to become our roadblock for exporting natural gas. And so you're talking 10 years. Now, one of the points that you think about as you look at this is how things change is all the major oil companies thought we would be importing natural gas 5 or 6 years ago. So that we have 12 LNG plants in the United States to import LNG. One of them is now going to be converted to export. And in 4 years, maybe Cheniere will be exporting gas, but it takes that long. And I mean, circumstances changed. And this creates this base. We can screw it up, but this creates a base for stronger economic growth in the United States than the rest of the world, the rest of the industrialized world. It creates an impregnable advantage. It's not something that a country like China that is trying to copy and borrow, and some accuse steal, intellectual ideas and so on, they can't capture this. They can develop their shale gas, but as I'll argue, their gas is going to be higher. They're going to have to subsidize it just because they don't have the industrial organization. And it actually changes to something that within a year of working over here at 1776, I was always writing about the negative impact of higher oil prices on the U.S. economy. Going forward, every increase in the world price of oil increases the competitive advantage enjoyed by the United States vis-a-vis everybody else. And so increases and accelerates our exports. And so we have literally turned everything on its head. Circumstances have changed. Well, how did we get here? And I think it's important to look at how we get here, because if you don't understand that, you're not going to understand how this change has come about and how surprising it is and how important it is. And I start in 1973 when Richard Nixon gave his speech in November calling for energy independence. And he said, just as we'd had the Manhattan Project and just as the Apollo projects, he declared we ought to achieve energy independence by 1980. And most of us who are economists looked at this and said, ain't going to happen. Well, it certainly didn't happen by 1980, but it probably will happen by the 50th anniversary. Why didn't it? Well, because Nixon was speaking at a time when the U.S. energy situation was dramatically changing and changing to favor imports. Oil, if you go back prior to the speech, U.S. oil had an import quota program to keep domestic prices higher. Many of the states had pro-rationing program limiting oil production. In the case of natural gas shipped from across state lines was controlled by under the supervision of the Federal Power Commission, which was replaced by the Federal Energy Commission under the Phillips decision that was 1954. We had price controls on natural gas. And we were just moving into the environmental movement. So as he spoke, power companies were moving away from coal to oil, and the oil industry was about to give up lead, which improved fuel economy for unleaded gasoline, fighting with the auto industry even then. Nixon looked at all this and said, we have to overcome this. The other element in there is the Santa Barbara oil spill was fresh on everybody's mind, so we weren't drilling off California. Still aren't. So President Nixon, looking at this, came up with an important set of proposals to achieve energy independence. They involved the breeder reactor, the fast breeder reactor, which promised to produce more energy than it consumed once we solved the problems. They involved developing shale oil in western Colorado, where we have thousands of barrels of shale, no water, and a series of other problems, the lip service to conservation. Essentially, President Nixon and his advisors proposed the high-cost solution to energy independence. President Ford took over within a year. He pushed this, called for decontrol of oil, called for improved auto fuel economy, offering the auto industry waivers on some environmental restrictions so that they'd improve fuel economy. He got that agreement, but the Congress didn't go along, and essentially was turned down by the Congress. The other thing that Nixon had done 7 days before he proposed this is he had signed the Emergency Petroleum Allocation Act, which imposed price controls and everything. So the economic signal sent to the oil industry was price controls, continued allocation. The United States is not a good place to invest in. And that was the operative thing. That followed the Carter administration. President Carter proposed solutions to decontrol with natural gas, extending controls across the country, initially continuing price controls, finally Emil Sunley and I in 1979, and the Carter administration pushed through decontrol, the windfall profits tax. And President Carter proposed to use the revenue from the windfall profits tax to build the Synthetic Fuels Corporation, which we built. So President Carter really continued this tradition, this proposal of high-cost solution to energy independence. And at the end of the Carter administration, the success was shown. Oil imports had not quite doubled, would have doubled had not one act that Nixon had proposed gone through, and that's the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And so, you know, we started just as in World War II, just after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Everything went downhill. And then we had what I'll call the Long Hibernation. I came here in the mid-'80s. The real reason, the thing that Fred forgot is I debated Jim Schlesinger in 1986, I think it was, 85, because the question was, would oil prices collapse? And Jim Schlesinger gave me a very good lesson in talking. He said, no, they're not going to collapse. Well, they did. You could see the markets working, but a number of other things. In this long hibernation, the Synthetic Fuels Corporation was closed down by the Reagan administration. The fast breeder reactor, which we thought was going to cost $500 million, was closed down after spending $10 billion. And the many other changes. The Ford administration and the Carter administration had pushed through fuel economy standards. The auto industry introduced SUVs, which worked around it, so the fuel economy kept going down. And so we were directionally through the 80s and the 90s moving to higher and higher imports. Circumstances then really changed, and several things happened to bring this around. The first was, I think, and one of the most important, the big oil industry abandoned the United States. The major oil companies left. And this is important. They did keep a vestigial position here, but they sold off oil fields. They laid off thousands of geologists and so on. Some of those geologists looked and said there is future in the United States, although Jim Schlesinger and the Carter administration had said we're not going to be producing much gas by 2000. These people looked and said, well, there is shale. There are these studies that there's this gas trapped. We have to figure out how to get it. The microcomputer revolution came along, and so that smaller companies could essentially buy the geological surveys and so on and process them on small computers. They didn't have to have the supercomputers and the supercomputer centers. So the technological area came along, and we solved horizontal completion. And so companies like Newfield figured out how to pull out natural gas using horizontal completion from the shallow Gulf of Mexico that was not, the majors had looked at and said, it's just not big enough for us. The majors saying we really need these big fields. The second thing that came along was we created futures markets. And I taught at Yale, and then I spent several years at Drexel Burnham, spent 2 years at Drexel Burnham, spent the rest of my life telling people how futures markets work. And today, the natural gas futures market is the world's largest physical commodity futures market. Bigger than corn, bigger than wheat, bigger than anything I can find. Now, these are my numbers. I could be wrong, but it is just huge. 2 years of consumption now covered by natural gas futures. And it originally started when the majors abandoned the heating oil market in New England. New England heats with oil. Historically, the major oil companies had supplied dealers with heating oil during the summer. They hadn't charged them for it until they actually sold it. They floated the funding because it made operating refineries more efficient. They called it summer fill. You built the tanks up and everything. As soon as decontrol came, the majors stepped out, said we don't want it in that business, be in that business. Part of the reason they stepped out was their experience with price control. Part of the experience was the very high interest rates that were prevailing at the time, from 20% from made it cost of building those inventories very expensive. So you essentially left small companies that couldn't raise the capital with the problem: how do they build their inventories? Wall Street stepped in. The New York Mercantile Exchange, which was a potatoes exchange, created the heating oil contract, and essentially within a year the oil industry was doing what farmers at many agricultural companies have been doing over the years: selling futures against inventory, speculators buying it, and it stabilized the prices and built the inventories. This then spread to natural gas, and so we have these venture entrepreneurs and so on wanting to develop natural gas and move ahead, needing capital. They go to the banks, and what the banks said is, if you hedge and you use the futures market, or you use the derivatives that are tied to the futures markets, we'll make you the loans, and we'll make you the loans at low interest rates. And so the investment in drilling in natural gas by the Newfields, the Chesapeakes, the Mitchell Energies, the Devons, and all, if you go through their annual reports and dig back into the risk disclosure statements, all of that started moving ahead, and that really began the process by which we developed natural gas and developed this. Now production is up probably 100% higher than one would have projected 5 years ago. And it is the entrepreneurialism and the high labor content on this natural gas that makes it hard to replicate the experience that the United States has had in other countries. China will succeed and so on, but it's these companies, it's my perception that these companies have managed to keep much better controls over their costs in expanding the production than the larger Sinopec and the major oil companies will have. And this is why I think if you talk frankly to a major oil company, they say, maybe we'll buy a company and try to keep the people doing it, but that just doesn't fit into the big company mentality. So what happened is, is we got this development of natural gas, we got the entrepreneurialism, all the technology, the use of technology just moved us ahead dramatically, and we're beginning to see the results and the success of this. Then we received a second benefit. The environmental regulators really provided a kickstart. One of my pet peeves is that we never go back and audit projections made by the EPA. People remind me of my forecasts or other environmental regulators. But over the last years, we've removed sulfur from gasoline. We've removed sulfur from diesel fuel. The EU removed sulfur from diesel fuel. And the projections always assumed that companies would make investments to remove sulfur. They'll desulfurization units, they'll do other things. In many cases, they didn't. For example, recently there have been 2 refineries closed on the East Coast, a third is going to close. If you go to the data that EIA puts out, that's gone out over the years, you can see how these companies did not invest to produce low sulfur fuel, even when New York and Pennsylvania said they were going to require low sulfur heating oil next year. What they had done to meet the new standards was change the mix of crude oil. Crude oil, there are literally 450 to 500 types of crude oil, and they vary in sulfur content from the Arab Heavy, which has 3.5% sulfur, or say about 4 kilos of sulfur, to the very fine Nigerian crudes that have maybe 50 grams of sulfur. And over time, you can look at an individual refinery and see how they got sweeter and sweeter crudes as the regulations changed. They didn't make the investment, they just they moved to different crudes that so they could produce the diesel. And what happened then is the EU switched to low sulfur diesel. In 2008, the refiners scrambled to find low sulfur crude to make diesel meeting these specifications. We had already gone there, we had enough desulfurization capacity. Europe and the US combined didn't, especially when Nigeria had a civil war and we lost supplies of low sulfur crude. So the low sulfur the Nigerian crude went down, price elasticity of demand are low, and prices went way up. And one of the, they asked whether you want charts, and today I don't want charts, but one of the key charts is if you look at retail prices of diesel in Europe, compare them to gasoline, normally it's at a discount. In 2008, diesel went to a premium because of this sulfur. Well, what that did is wake up the auto industry, combined with the recession in 2009, near depression, and their near-death experience. And so the auto industry turned and began to look at fuel economy, and the Obama administration has just gotten, last July, the first real commitment by the auto industry to improve fuel economy dramatically. So we're looking at 50 mile per gallon cars in the middle of the next decade. Meantime, consumers have gotten the message, and gasoline demand, at least as I measure it, and I rely on the Bureau of Economics data because they measure consumption, gasoline demand has been falling recently at a rate of between 5 and 6% year over year, and it's accelerating. Consumers are borrowing from the Fed or borrowing from auto dealers at 1% and getting much more efficient cars, and so they don't have to borrow from the bank at 13% for their increased gasoline consumption. And what we're seeing is a dramatic turn. You know, in the finance we say this is a substitution of fixed for variable. And it's a swap, but it's a swap that's hurting the oil industry. Now, that swap and that move away from gasoline is going to come back to dramatically affect this market in the next 2 years. The Bush administration in 2007 proposed to increase the use of ethanol. President Bush, in his 2007 State of the Union message, called for us to be using almost 2 million barrels a day of ethanol by 2020, I think. And we're at 1 million barrels a day now. Congress wrote that into law. And what that means is as gasoline demand falls, the share of ethanol in gasoline has to go up. Given the way that petroleum is marketed and given the divorcement of the oil industry from marketing, Exxon doesn't have to my knowledge, Exxon has nobody to deal with consumers, whereas Apple probably has 100,000 people. It tells you about the relative value of the corporations now. What's going to happen is more gasoline is going to have to be sold that has 85% ethanol and 15% gasoline. And that will happen through the market system because the EPA sells ethanol credits. They call them RINs. And the price of RINs will go up so that consumers will see a price of regular gasoline, say at $5 a gallon, a price of E85 at $2 a gallon, and that will accelerate the conversion of purchases of E85 automobiles, and that will pick up speed, further accelerating the decline in gasoline demand. Now, a lot of people, every time I make that point, say, well, we don't like ethanol. We don't like the ethanol subsidy. And it struck me that yesterday we got into a similar question at the Supreme Court. Is it a tax or is it a regulation? And this is a regulation. It just creates the market and it makes it happen. And I don't see how that one's going to convince the Congress to change the ethanol regulation. So what this is going to do is accelerate the decline in the use of gasoline. So as we turn this, what's going to happen is, particularly in this middle part of the United States, there's this surplus ethanol, and lots more crude coming from North Dakota, lots of crude coming from the Eagle Ford Shale, and so that we're essentially going to have a surplus in crude building up, and we're going to confront very soon the question of, do we have enough refining capacity on the Gulf Coast to export products? And here we're at least lucky in that our refineries on the Gulf Coast are producing products that are needed in Europe because the Europeans are a diesel market and they don't have the diesel refining capacity. We are going to have a question how we supply the East Coast. We'll build more pipelines. But we are moving, that part of the country is going to have a surplus of crude. Add to it the Canadian crude that comes south, and in the last 2 weeks, TransCanada, a proponent of Keystone, has announced that they're looking seriously at exporting crude through Montreal because they've obviously done the sums and see that the building surplus in the middle of the United States. it is possible that for a few years, because of the difficulty in arbitrage, we're going to have prices in the middle of the country substantially below the prices of petroleum products in the on the East Coast and on the West Coast and in the rest of the world. It's already happened. In Denver the other day, I paid $3.20 a gallon, and I'd seen $5 in Palm Springs the day before. So I mean, it is, these huge geographical differences are building, and they're going to stay. And so what we have is this kind of powerhouse of country, and it extends up to Alberta and Canadians that have access to low-cost oil and low-cost natural gas. And it is we're going to be moving forward, for 5, 10 years, maybe more, to really have this competitive advantage vis-a-vis the rest of the world. We're going to have more and more firms moving ethane crackers here, because now, years ago we all thought all the ethylene cracking would go to the Persian Gulf, where it's cheap natural gas. Now it's going to come here. You've got a more secure investment environment. You don't have the political insecurity. Well, leave out the Tea Party, but you have and you have the same price natural gas, inexpensive natural gas. You're going to have other businesses coming as well, and it lays the foundation for I think for 10 to 15 years, maybe, and my optimism, I say 30 years, where the United States is going to have a leg up on the other countries. This advantage will grow as crude prices grow. Now, if you read the comments on OPEC, most of the oil exporting countries now need relatively high prices of oil. Particularly following the Arab Spring, they've made a number of promises and increased expenditures to try to buy political peace. And so they have to work for higher prices. In Russia, Vladimir Putin made a set of promises to win the election. And so you look at the promises he made, he needs higher oil prices in Russia. And most of the prices of natural gas into Western Europe are tied to the price of crude. So what's going to happen is Europe is going to see steadily rising prices until they can break this link. In Asia, you have the Japanese. I thought it was 52 nuclear reactors, but Howard tells me now Japan's down 2 of 52, 4 reactors were working. Howard Greenspot tells me that they're now down to 1 operating nuclear power plant out of 54. And so the Japanese are having to buy LNG, and they're buying crude to process. And so they're dealing, as the Wall Street Journal stole my thunder this morning in the front of the second page, we're dealing with $2.70, $2.50 natural gas. The Japanese are paying $17 a 1,000 cubic feet. So it is a competitive advantage. As oil prices go up, that advantage widens. There's this fear. You keep hearing that drilling will stop because of the low spot price of natural gas. You already hear some drilling programs slowing. Everybody's focused on the spot price, and what they neglect again is the effect of the futures market, because 2 years worth of natural gas is sold forward. There are lots of buyers. Oil markets aren't as efficient. There are many buyers that are DuPonts and utilities and other companies, and so the forward curve is in pretty steep contango, and producers can sell 2 or 3 years forward, locking in prices that will guarantee them enough to cash flow to keep their operations going. They buy puts to protect themselves so the price goes up. This is a really efficient financial market, and it is moving us ahead, and it will sustain this base for some time to come, as long as Gary Gensler doesn't screw it up. And I have spent most of the last 30 years working on futures markets. There's this debate on whether speculation caused the price increase. I don't think so, looking at the fundamentals. But I worry Dodd-Frank could in some way lead to a restriction on the futures market, which would impair this competitive advantage. But assuming not, we're going to have this. We're going to be moving ahead for some time. And the other thing is, we're relying really on the small independents, lower cost firms. We're not relying on the majors, the large major companies. And in some sense, these companies have very little future left in the United States. They're high cost, We have found this independence not through the low-cost solution, high-cost solution pursued by Nixon and many in the 60s, and the 70s and 80s. We have found a low-cost solution, and we blundered there. We didn't. We didn't get there by plan. These companies, the big companies, generally don't do low-cost operations very well. They don't do retail. They've moved out of retail because that wasn't theirs. And so, they can, as long as the Europeans do not start to embrace this low-cost approach to it, and as long as the Asians don't, they'll do fine. But the thing is, that will just increase our competitive advantage. My worry is that within 20 years, some of these big companies will suffer their Kodak moment. And it's, like Kodak, find that they are no longer needed. Their focus has been finding large fields that are very capital intensive and require fairly high prices to maintain. The emergence of this disruptive technology, which is really what shale gas is, changes their situation. The question is whether the rest of the world will persist on this, whether Russia will persist on this, or whether there will be a price break. And literally that, their future rests on OPEC holding together and keeping prices up so that the oil exporting countries can sustain themselves. And the longer they do, the better for the United States. Yesterday I told somebody that I see 3-speed growth in the world: the United States in the fast lane, China in the middle lane, and the other countries in the slow lane. And the person quite correctly said, China's, given the China income per capita and so on in China will still be growing faster. But our growth rate will be substantially higher, and the growth rate will pick up as we get the increased technology, assuming we can overcome some of the infrastructure problems. Clearly, we're going to need to deal with highway issues, railroad issues, and the like to move forward quickly. We may wind up electrifying some of our railroads, which would be a great way to use the natural gas. But I mean, it is just, the circumstances have changed dramatically. And I find, it's every time I start thinking about this, I find new thoughts, and I've been doing this now for, as I say, for 40 years, and it's just stunning. So, Mike, and the other things that come about of this is we're going to have faster growth. So, as my fiscal economist friends tell me, the budget deficit becomes less of a problem because we get stronger growth, assuming the tax structure isn't, we don't make another big mistake on a tax cut. And that just a whole series of macro implications going forward. I think one of them is going back to my first days here at the Institute, where I learned my international economics, is that we could see, we'll see a stronger dollar. Ed Morris has made some of the same comments in a Citicorp study. We didn't coordinate. One of the things he said was, well, our trade deficit is going to go down. And I learned here that the trade deficit has nothing to do with the trade deficit had everything to do with a savings investment imbalance and nothing, and so that the question is whether we reduce our use the money to reduce our deficit. The dollar, Fred's favorite subject. If this really does become we become a stronger economy, the dollar is going to strengthen because all of the capital inflows and because of our increased export, exchange rates will adjust. That actually, again, works to our competitive advantage because oil is priced in dollars. That's going to accelerate the problems in Western Europe. And I think I've only begun to scratch this egg. I mean, it is just a very important change. And as I said, I'm also conclude, I'm just stunned to be standing here and making these talks now because a year ago I wouldn't have believed this. As a young man working over for the Ford Foundation, you never saw this coming. And so no doubt there are other changes coming that will offset this, but it is an amazing and very important change for the U.S. economy and for the world economy going forward. Let me stop there.